Hi, this is Allan McKay, and I'm really excited to do this visual effects breakdown on episode 5 of season 8 of Game of Thrones as we get into doing the visual effects and discussing a lot of the process involved. So previously I've done a lot of VFX case studies on Star Wars Rogue One, Venom, and Avengers Infinity War, as well as a lot of other different projects. And I wanted to approach this from the perspective of someone that, although I have worked on Game of Thrones, I have not been involved in this season, and I wanted to just more give my perspective on how I would deconstruct a lot of the visual effects in this episode. So I think this is going to be a lot of fun to dive into and talk about the process, as well as glorify a lot of the amazing visuals that were done by Weta, Image Engine, Pixelmondo, Scanline, Rodeo, and many other studios as well. So let's dive into this episode. Finally, before we get into this, I'd love to make this a discussion. So, in other words, feel free to leave as many comments as you like, whether they're questions, whether they're observations, key takeaways, or aha moments, anything that you want. Feel free to post as many times as you like, and I'll do my best to respond to everyone who posts comments and questions as well. So in addition to that, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I'm going to be posting a lot of tutorials as well as more VFX breakdowns and other content similar to this over the coming weeks, so it's going to be a lot of fun. And feel free to like this and share it. It would mean the world to me, so I want to say thank you ahead of time if you do take a moment to share this. So I'm really excited. Let's get into this episode. Okay, so just talking about this for a minute, I'm going to go into a bit of the environment stuff because I think that this is really cool to chat about. I'm assuming that this work's done by Rodeo over in Montreal and LA. In the past, I've done a lot of digital environments, set extensions, matte paintings for Game of Thrones. I actually interviewed Matt Conway, who's a matte painter who works there quite often on Game of Thrones on the podcast. I think it's episode 59. So if you go to allanmckay.com/59, you can check out that episode. We talk a lot about Game of Thrones in there. And just in general, the way that these are usually broken down is that you would do a 3D. It really depends, actually, and I know a lot of the behind the scenes on Game of Thrones, but you would typically mock everything out in 3D and then do projection mapping for everything. There are times, though, when you know that you're going to be looking at, let's say, an environment like this from like every angle, which you are in the show. That's when you might go the extra step and go and build out digital assets for everything. And that gives you complete freedom to be able to move the camera any direction you want with zero limitations, and also just have freedom when doing fly-throughs, things like that. So in general, and in a lot of previous Game of Thrones, you might have some geometry, let's say for foreground, things like that, if there's just a couple of shots like this. And then you would traditionally just do projections where you need to. With a crane shot like this, you would probably mock out geometry for everything in the foreground and midground. And then everything in the background would typically be just basic geometry and doing a matte painting over it all. And then in the far background, the FBG, you can just have all of that as 2D. Now, like I said, given the fact that in this episode of Game of Thrones, you're looking at everything from every angle, and I highly doubt that you would break it down per shot, rather build out 3D digital assets for everything, and then when you bring them in on a shot-by-shot basis, you can start to populate little bits of steam and dust and things like that throughout the shots. Smoke later on when we get into destruction, all those bits and pieces. But I would just assume that this is all digital assets, rather than just going traditionally for painting, mostly because there's just so many shots. The volume count would require it to be 3D, just so that way you can view it from every angle, rather than building it all from scratch. But obviously painting in the details where you need to throughout all of this. So one thing I'm going to talk a little bit about later on is crowds. And I think that even just the subtlety of having something in here, it just gives life to it. I remember seeing movies when I was younger where, let's say I go on a date and I'd point out like a matte painting or something, and it's kind of funny, the people I'd be with who maybe had never paid much attention to VFX would suddenly start seeing matte paintings everywhere. And it's one of those things that usually you might have a section that might be footage, and then the rest just is like an extension matte painting. And a lot of the time it just doesn't have life, and that's also why you'll see birds and things like that. Just every single cheat you can think of to populate it, help with emphasizing scale, as well as just giving life to what's typically static. So something like this, just having that little pocket of people here, it's subtle, but it's just these little things are just giving life to something that obviously is digital and is pretty stagnant in a lot of ways. Same thing that you would have like moving steam, things like that, but you're not going to notice it because the camera pans too quick. So that's in general, the basic overview, I should say, of this. And like I said, this is something that you would see throughout a lot of shots. So I'm not going to put too much emphasis on the environment, but I think it's worthwhile mentioning that you approach shots differently based on the volume. If it's a couple of one-offs, then painting you can get away with. If you're going to do destruction, then typically you're going to need to model out certain bits. In this case, because there's a lot of shots, it just makes sense to go completely digital and then paint in on a shot-by-shot basis detail where needed if something's lacking or just doesn't hold up too close to camera. So even shots like this, if you have a digital environment, then it's just going to be easy to make it more of a throwaway shot. Drop this in the background and just do a simple track for it. So jumping ahead a little bit though, there's a bunch of shots like this. I think there's one a little bit further along here as well. There we are. So there's a couple of ones here, slightly different angles. I would just assume that this is basic geometry and just a heck of a lot of painting. Just so that way you're getting at least like a kind of 2.5D view, rather than, let's say, jumping to a shot like this where it's an all digital environment. Now again, like, it really comes down to the choice of the supervisors as well as how it's bid out. But, in general, that's what I would just assume, is to treat these as really dense matte painting shots. But then you would have shots like this that are completely digital. And that way, like, let's say Rodeo or one of the other studios can focus on doing these more up above shots, showing all the shot progression of all the destruction of the city. And that's one thing I'll get into later on, but I really like that over time you see the progression from, let's say, early on where we see a little bit of fire, smoke, and then, jumping ahead a little bit, but you would see more and more of the destruction happen over time, and continues to kind of narrate the story, telling how much of the city is being destroyed. So I think it's really cool. Shots like this, it also makes sense that way, whether it's Image Engine or Weta doing a lot of this, they can just focus on, doing their thing. They go to digital environment, dragging, and doing a lot of the destruction as well. So again, another 3D shot, all digital environment, dragging. And yeah, I mean, I think this stuff looks so cool. It's so well done. And then shots like this, I would imagine, are shots. But yeah, so I just want to kind of touch on the environment for a minute, just because I feel like it's something that's worthwhile discussing, mainly from the point of view of when you're approaching a lot of sequences like these, especially something like this episode, which is basically a feature film. So instead of a few cutaways where you need extensions and matte paintings, it's kind of like, okay, well, we need to have this massive city that doesn't exist and slowly show it being destroyed. So that's where you're going to break it down into different sequences. So shots like this that are more at the larger scale that you're going to see them, they've got a certain point, which is to tell what's happening in certain areas. That way you can cut to those areas, show that the entire city is being affected. So again, just to kind of put context to everything. And also to show scale, as well as more POV of Cersei up in the towers. So, and of course, in context of what the dragon is doing. So there's a lot of reasons behind having shots like this, but this is something that typically can be sectored off to a studio to do all the matte painting for these, whereas then you can focus on shots that require destruction or shots that require creature work and digital environments, and those could necessarily be done by a different studio altogether. I'm also really excited that I think I counted 6 of the students inside my mentorship who worked on this episode. So congratulations to all of them for their hard work, not only from going from my mentorship into working at a lot of these studios like Weta and Scanline and Pixamondo, doing visual effects on the biggest TV show on TV right now. So I think it's really epic, and I was really proud of them to see their name in the credits, knowing that they had just finished the course months ago and they're already working on big sequences like this. So that is so cool. On top of that, make sure to go to vfxcourse.com. I've got a 8-video free live action class which goes through creating entire visual effects destruction shots, destroying some of downtown LA, taking the shots from start to finish, which I think would be really beneficial. All of that's free. Check it out if you want as well. So vfxcourse.com. And that should be like a good follow-up for this as well. All right, so let's get onto the creature stuff, because I think that this is going to be interesting just to chat about. So I really like how they've done all the dragon stuff in general, having like a hydraulic body to interact with on a closed stage, so that way you can get really interesting camera moves, pre-vis it all, figure out exactly what you want to do, and then get those exact shots. I'd imagine like previs, especially on a project like this, is just so critical to be able to get everything in context of how you want. Buddy of mine, Dan Catcher, he's been responsible for building these dragons since the very beginning. So the little babies that were initially in the end of season 1, that was all Dan, and Dan's continued to be the father of dragons basically, and design these dragons initially on Pixamondo side and then specifically client side throughout all 8 seasons. So Dan's kind of continued to evolve the dragons as they grow up. So the amount of detail, everything about this is just so amazing. I also did a podcast interview with Derek Spears, who was one of the visual effects supervisors for Rhythm Hughes on a couple of seasons of Game of Thrones. So we talked a lot about that on the podcast. I think it's episode 187, and it was kind of interesting just talking about some of the challenges that they had, how they were shooting everything from doing the fire breath and everything else is really cool. And of course, in later seasons, just kind of seeing all the work that's gone into these. So again, just more of the wide shots, just kind of showing, again, the kind of dialogue, I guess, going on between Cersei and Dany down here. So in other words, Dragon, and then her in the foreground here. So again, it's just kind of showing perspective of where she is, where this is down here, all the destruction, again, all the progression that happens with it as well. So I think one of the big challenges with doing all the creature work is that rather than doing kind of mid-ground or background creature work, like let's say here, having something that far down there is not too challenging. It's very forgiving. But to have something that holds up here where it doesn't feel like you're, having a card, like a character sitting on a badly lit 3D creature, instead of having something that really interacts and feels like it's there. It's breathing, it has all this detail, the motion blur, everything just holds up really well. I think it's such a huge challenge, and I think it's beautifully done. I haven't had a chance to check with Weta because it's still early here, and I decided last night to do this. So I've talked with Scanline and a few of the other studios, Pixamondo, who are involved, but Image Engine and Weta, I would imagine, would be doing a lot of creature work as well as a lot of other stuff. But I'd assume that this is Image Engine, but I could be wrong. But yeah, it's beautifully done. I really like what they've done there. So just in general, though, I mean, again, the creature work is one of those things that there's so much work that goes into it, and I think we kind of take it for granted in a lot of ways just because we see so many digital characters these days. It isn't as jaw-dropping as when you see Gollum come to life, or even Jar Jar Binks back in the day. But that's just it. Like the fact that you don't even give it a second thought. The fact that people get emotional when they see one of the dragons die, it says so much about how accepting we are of these creatures and how well they've been executed. So I just want to jump ahead a little bit. I'm going to talk about the destruction of fire. It's probably going to be the main thing I want to talk about, just because it's kind of interesting seeing that in context, and there's just so much of it. I don't think I've seen this much destruction in any TV show ever. But just looking through a lot of this, I feel like there's a lot of pyro, a lot of destruction, atmosphere, environmental effects, and I think that they're so critical to helping with scale as well as integration. So in other words, having a dragon here, instead of just having it fly off, actually having, when Drogo takes off, kind of break the environment a little bit. It just gives it that weight and gives it that realism that it's lifting off and it's kind of pushing away from the building. Having all these things tie it together and make it not feel so light or disconnected from the environment. And I think that the big challenge with a project like this is when you're switching from, as I mentioned before, wide shots of matte paintings to digital environments to miniatures to live action sets with extensions and combinations, all of these different things, to make them all tie together. It's just so important to use every trick you can think of. So having heavy amounts of smoke and haze, the environments having all the dust elements, the haze here, the smoke, all the things in the background, all of these things bring it together. Whenever it's too clean, it's always going to look not correct. The more you gritty things up, the more it's believable because it's being sandwiched in between all these other things. Anyone who goes through my mentorship or works on one of my projects like Soup knows that with fire especially, I'm pretty critical about this stuff. So I can get a little bit picky at times when I see like daytime shots with glow. I completely understand that this is a very overcast day, but I'm always going to be a little bit like, there's too much glow in some of this fire, things like that. I think this fire looks beautiful, but it's one of those things that just, if it was a little bit more, I'd probably get picky about seeing some of that. So I think that in general, there's 3 different types of fire, and we'll get into effects in a moment, but there's 3 different types of fire that we're dealing with. There's fire that's shot practically on set, and then there's going to be fire that's shot separately, either as stock or as a second unit element that then is brought in and comped into the shot, and then there's digital fire that's simulated typically. So with a lot of these, I would imagine these to be either simulated or just using footage in the background. It's not too big a challenge there. Some of the stuff in the foreground here, I would just imagine is simulated, just because having it this close to the dragon, having it as a real hero shot, I wouldn't want to risk or waste time trying to get away with doing practical to save a bit of time, knowing that full well it would probably end up going digital in the end, just to get that interaction from the wings, like affecting it, things like that, even if it's very subtle. So I would just assume, even though like at first glance I feel like that feels practical, I would just assume it is digital, because I don't understand why you wouldn't do it that way. So all of this is really beautifully done. It is YouTube, so I gotta be careful not to hang on frames for too long, but again, all digital environment. And again, like I said, there might be things where you go in and paint over these to detail them out, but I would imagine that they start out digital just because it's quite different to the other shots, but more importantly, having accurate lighting and just with the camera pan and perspective. So I'd assume that this is all live action. It's kind of interesting. They've had so much success finding really great locations to shoot a lot of this, but at the same time, like you'd be surprised how many shots are the foreground might be practical, but then everything else is digital. And that's one thing that Rodeo has done a lot of stuff in Game of Thrones for, is just adding set extensions to everything, so that way you might see a rock and then there's a giant castle. The castle is entirely painted. So, just jumping ahead, I think this is such a hero shot, like really important shot, and like obviously all digital, but all these secondary effects, like having some interaction where the environment breaks apart from his nails, his fingers, his claws, like hooking into the ground, or sorry, into the wall, having all the dust, all the other elements, like all these little things are what really help sell the shot. If things are too clean, then they just look wrong. That's something I've noticed with video games in more recent years, was when games started to add lots of effects. That's what really sells a shot, because if you go back to, like, let's say 99, 2000, a lot of video games will look wrong because they would just be this infinite open space. And because of that, as soon as you can start to add patches of light, volumetric lights, little dust mites and things like that in the air, all these little bits and pieces that help tie it all together, and they fill out that negative space. So shots like this, having that dust, having the interaction, little rocks and everything breaking as the claws plant into the wall, these are all the things that really do help sell that shot. And I'd assume digital double up here of Danny. But yeah, that looks beautiful. So one thing I figured I'd talk about just very briefly is a lot of the gore that's happening. You got a lot of people fighting. They've got swords, they've got spears. How do you do that? So you got rubber swords, and a lot of times you might even have like a dagger or an axe or a spear that doesn't have an actual sharp pointing end, and that would be added, like tracked and added digitally. Again, bring up the podcast, but I interviewed Sean Ritchie on Walking Dead, and we talked about that process for all those guys. So everyone would typically have a knife without the blade, and you would have to track in the blade so that way you can stab someone in the eye or do whatever. So I believe Scanline VFX did a lot of the blood and gore, especially with the Hound and the mountain fight, adding a lot in there. So I don't know about this sequence in particular, but I do know that they were doing a lot of digital blood and things like that. But things like this in the past, you would do, you would have cards where you would do squibs of blood, shoot them on a green screen, and then comp them in. These days, it just makes a lot more sense to go 3D wherever possible. Equalizer, there's a big fight scene, the bar scene in the movie with Denzel, where he goes in, he takes out like 12 guys or something using a corkscrew and all these other different items in the room. It was interesting with that Denzel didn't want to get his hands dirty, so myself and Adele Maximore went in and created all the blood wherever anyone gets stabbed or hit or anything like that. So it's kind of interesting, just kind of seeing the different approaches to a lot of this. But this sort of thing, it isn't too difficult now. It's like half a day to a day per shot I would probably bid out to do all these blood sims. Usually I would imagine it's about half a day for most of them. But then with revisions and everything, I'd assume like, a day and a half. You got other shots like this. I love this shot. Just the decapitation, or sorry, not quite. There's a decap in a moment, but just having the sword actually go in and hook in to the body. I think that was brilliant. So shots like this, I'd imagine just doing it all in 3D makes the most sense. Having a digital blade, so just kind of more acting it out as if there's the sword stuck in there when it's not, and just doing a 3D sword coming through. This is all shader and modeling for it all. And yeah, that's beautiful. Really cool, really gory. And then the hand shot here. So again, pretty straightforward, just match moving the hands and then digitally having them get cut off, doing the blood sims, everything else with it. So I'll go through frame by frame. I always feel bad to go through frame by frame when I think most people are praying that no one ever does with their work. But I love the fact that that looks like it's an actual, like a soft body sim, because it actually looks like it's hitting the ground. Like, that's the other thing too, is typically when you're doing shots like this, you'll have handles. Unless it's New York, usually it's about 12 frame handles on either end. So in other words, if a shot's 48 frames, then you would have an additional 24 frames to go on top of that. And so you might end up doing a sim of the fingers hitting the ground and doing all that, and it looks really cool. And then in the edit, you don't have that anymore. And it's really frustrating to be like, I spent so long on that, and you don't get to appreciate it. So here's the decap, which I thought was kind of cool. So again, you can see it's a 3D fluid sim, and just all the different elements. The sprits, I think, are really critical. I see a lot of people doing dynamic sims that just don't look right because, again, they're too clean. You'll hear me always talk about negative space, because in the real world, you know, if you look at all the layers that go into here, you got people here, you got the set background back here, in between this guy in the foreground and back here, you've got all the haze, all the dust, you got the sprits, you got more blood being kicked around, all of these different things that build up the shot. And if anything, it's removing that cleanliness from the shot. It's giving it more volume. So yeah, that's beautiful. And there's another one, axe to the neck. So, and I think that just by having a couple of shots in a tight sequence to give context to this, like, it means that you don't need to have this sort of stuff throughout every single shot. It's just assumed when you've got so much chaos, but then you kind of cut to emphasizing this for, 10 seconds. That's all you need to kind of capture the brutality of it all, and then you don't need to demonstrate it as much for the rest of it. So I think that was really well done. It was great. So I figured I'd just talk about that because there is a lot of that. Like I said, I believe Scanline did all of that. I could be wrong, but I do know that there's other sequences that they were doing a lot of blood and I'm assuming blade replacements. But yeah, I mean, any shots like this, I'd imagine a lot of this is all digitally enhanced. In other words, adding fog and things like that in there, or entirely replacing the backgrounds altogether. But yeah, I'd assume a shot like this that you would track in CG blade at the front, and then that way you can go in and do the impaling. In the past, you might do something really hokey, like it goes under his arm and you cup it. But these days, like, people kind of want and expect to see, a blade, blood, all that kind of stuff. So cool. So I talked about this earlier, but one thing I really liked is that they do these cutaways where they'll show all the destruction, everything happening throughout these shots. And I think it's just really important to give context to, like, what's going on in the city, because when you're cutting into these extremely tight shots like here, it's hard to think, well, is that just happening there or what's going on? So just cutting away to these, it kind of helps really kind of show the devastation and destruction that's happening throughout the entire city. And more importantly, initially you might have a few smokestacks, bit of fire, probably more towards the water where it all began. And then by the end of it, you can see that all of this, like the progression over time, and it's just important to kind of show, let's say, cutting to Cersei, seeing that, she's failing, the war is kind of one-sided. And so these sorts of shots, these sorts of shots are really important just to kind of give context to that. So they're quite important. And then you got other ones like this. I feel like, because there's a couple of, like, 3 shots, I think, in here that are these, and I feel like they're done by a different studio, just because the colors, I don't know, I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but, like, basically these are a lot more high contrast shots. There's a lot of them. So I just feel like these were done by a different supervisor, possibly and probably a different studio. There's a couple of things that are happening. Okay, so yeah, I'm just looking through this. There's one shot here that I feel is probably a different compositor because they've gone and added this kind of depth of field to make this area down here defocused. So none of these other shots have it because it shouldn't have it. And I think it's kind of interesting that this managed to slip through the cracks. Joe Bauer, I've never worked with him, but he's the VFX soup for all of Game of Thrones, and he definitely isn't afraid to say what he wants, which is great. But I also know that they're very meticulous about the shots on the client side as they come in. So I'm just pointing this out because none of these other shots have this depth of field, and specifically from like what you would capture in a lens, you would never get this at all. Like this is pretty much all considered to be background. There's no midground or foreground. So having that depth of field down here, it looks like a really bad Instagram filter. You know, the depth of field that you can kind of add on to center focus and things. So yeah, I find that interesting. I'm guessing that this shot was comped by a different compositor to the other ones just because, oops, none of the other ones have that problem. So yeah, it's kind of interesting because yeah, that should never be out of focus like that. I always do find that like when you are shooting things digitally, if you work on set, if you've got a lot of experience with cameras, you know how cameras work, and it's really problematic when you get people who are comping elements together and they don't really understand how a lens or the camera sensor works. So, okay, so actually moving the shot along a little bit, she should be out of focus, absolutely. She's a foreground element. All of this, though, is a background, and there's no real midground. So for this, you know, I won't hang on it too long, but yeah, this should not be the case at all. So I like that rack focus right there, having it out of focus as it shifts from in focus here to focusing in there, and all of that goes out of focus. That's how a lens will work. So, or how the focal length will work. So, you know, again, these shots here kind of feel a bit more like they're by the same studio because there's a lot of contrast between them. I think this is cool. Again, this is shot progression as far as I'm concerned. It's showing the demise of the city. The whole city is falling apart. So really amazing. I like the fact that they had the wildfire there. I guess I need to be more of a Game of Thrones fan to understand like why there is the green wildfire everywhere, whether it's because of the Targaryen king initially having it all back down there back in the day because I know he wanted to burn the city down, or it's just that stuff's been scattered throughout the city underground. But maybe someone can leave in the comments like why that is. But yeah, I think it's really cool just to kind of give some variation or differentiation to everything going on. So one last thing I'm just going to talk about really quickly is the crowds, because I think that is an important factor to talk about. I don't want to go too deep into it, but it's well worthwhile kind of just touching base on it. So in general, there's a lot of digital crowd shots, and they're so necessary just to help, again, just like the map painting showing these really wide shots of the entire city being destroyed. These are important to the show population, the show density. So in other words, you'll notice like most of the time you're going to have shots like this. I think this is like a 35 mil, but then a lot of tighter shots like here. I think that's a 50 or 85, depends how far back the camera is. But you'll get a lot of these as these soldiers are running up here. These are all very tight, so that way you can show a lot of soldiers and kind of hint towards there's lots of people and it's a very populated area. But then as long as you have occasionally shots like this to kind of show context, you can get away with having very few people in a specific shot. So shots like that, obviously there's a lot of extras, and you know, it makes sense on certain shows where you don't have the resources, but a show like this, one of the last episodes, like you're going to have a lot of extras. So I don't think it's an issue of like them not having enough people. I think that you would probably have a couple hundred people around at any given time, but obviously you need these bigger shots to give context to like how many people, because it's meant to be at least 1 million people in the city. So even shots like this again, where depending on how much of this is practical, like an actual set piece, but you got all these guys up here. I would imagine it's broken up into these guys up here are a set, and then these guys down here are a separate set, and then doing motion control. There's a lot of motion control operators on, I was looking through the credits on this episode, so I'm just kind of curious about that, or going completely digital with a lot of the environments. So either way, having all these people down here is that context. It just helps show that right now, at this part of the story, inside the walls is completely empty. There's not that many people. There's soldiers all prepping, but the population, the majority are all outside, and so they need to be let indoors. And I'd assume that this is shot, and then this is shot, and then a lot of the rest of it is all digital. That's my guess. But that's also why you have shots like this, where the camera pans down to a soldier. So that way, let's just assume, like, if everyone was 3D, having someone in here to help bridge it all together and make it real people is really important. So it's kind of interesting when I see shots like this, where they'll pan down. Sorry, I'm really terrible at this. When they'll pan down to a person in the foreground like this, it makes me wonder whether or not they actually went completely digital in certain shots like this, just because for me, I would just imagine like the validation of having someone like this in the foreground is because of that. So, it's kind of interesting. I'm not saying that this is all digital, but when I do see shots like this where they do pan down to a foreground actual actor doing their thing, then it makes me think that perhaps they're justifying, the fact that everything else is digital. So again, more matte paintings. This is interesting just because it's showing it before all the destruction or anything actually goes on. And then again, more population to show everyone's inside now. So these are really important storytelling pieces, and also to show sheer scale, having people around. So cutting to some of the soldier shots, again, same thing. One of the key things with crowds in general is that you want chaos. So showing people out of place, showing idle animation, things like that is so important to give realism. And it's kind of interesting with the Unsully and with these guys, like, because they're meant to be like an elite army, they're not going to have the chaos, the out of formation too much, the idle animations, all these things that really help, because they're meant to be, really have their shit together. So that's kind of interesting, just because, again, it's kind of counterintuitive. It's the sort of things that the tricks that you'll use to get crowds to be more believable is the randomness that these guys probably wouldn't do. I would imagine it a little bit more with these guys up here, but these guys down here are meant to be, the pros that are brought in. So same thing with these guys. So at least, all these dudes here are not going to be moving too much, but that's the sort of thing that adds realism. So again, foreground, I'd imagine a majority of this here is all live action, and then from there, an extension of all these guys in the background. So what else we got? So again, this is all on set. I am interested about the fire in a lot of these shots, and we'll talk about that in a moment. I would imagine that this is all just practical fire, but there are certain shots like this that I feel like this is all digital, and actually makes sense in a shot like this, because I think a majority of this shot is actually digital. So I'd imagine maybe this is foreground element is live action, and then everything here is digital. That's all green screen. But yeah, so again, more crowds, and it's such a critical storytelling piece. again, I haven't had a chance to talk to Weta this morning to kind of see who did what, but maybe they're doing all the crowds. I have no idea. Usually these days, I would assume that Weta would be doing the creature work, but having Image Engine in on this, and there not being much else other than dragons, there isn't, I can't imagine the work being split up between two studios for that. So that makes me think that Image Engine most likely did all the dragon work. Weta did maybe some of the destruction. I'm not sure, but I could see them doing crowds, things like that. And again, sorry, I'm thinking outside the box here, but remembering the credits, I remember some of the people. A couple of my friends at Weta were on it, who are all animators. So, but they're more keyframe animators. So I'm curious now as to what their work on this was. But either way, again, just a really critical storytelling piece is having all the soldiers dropping their swords. Just so critical to kind of show this. But yeah, maybe I'll do a follow-up and just talk about, like, actually talking with a few of the studios, like what their contributions specifically were. Just because I think it'd be fun to get the specifics. Because I know Rodeo doing a lot of the environments, background set extensions, map paintings. Scanline did a lot of destruction, did a lot of fire, did a lot of gore and blade replacements between, I think, 3 of their offices. And so that makes me think that Image Engine would have done dragons, and then Weta, I'm guessing maybe some digital environment work and crowds. But yeah, it's hard to say. Okay, so again, I wanted to cover these just because I think it's important to chat a little bit about this and go in talking about just how these were set up. But I think for me, a majority of this is going to be the destruction, the fire, because I don't think I've ever seen a TV show have such a large quantity of destruction shots, let alone the digital environments and everything else that went with it. So I think it's just going to be really interesting to chat about that. So getting into the destruction here, initially there's all the water stuff down here. Drogo comes in and messes everything up. So it's pretty cool seeing all the destruction. One thing I really like that they've done, again, I can't play through all of this, unfortunately, just because YouTube, but I really like the feel for this, where it isn't so much necessarily the fire that's causing the destruction. It feels more high velocity. It feels like the fire as a projectile hitting everything is ripping everything apart, rather than fire comes down and engulfs everything. So, you saw that with the wall being destroyed at the end of last season, but it's really effective, and it's just like a consistent thing throughout all these shots, is that the breath itself is very destructive. It has a lot of force behind it. So I love the shot just because it is like one continuous shot. Unfortunately, I can't play through it all, but just coming in and looking at a few things like this, really cool. And Pixelmondo worked on this too, and if I were to guess, I just realized that they worked on that as well. I would imagine they probably did all the water stuff because they've just done so much of it in the past. I interviewed, who was it? It was Michael Wortman, one of the VFX supervisors at Pixelmondo, in episode 124. So we talked about all the work they did for, I forget which season now, but the big wildfire ship destruction scene, or sequence, I should say. So again, there's a lot of people on the podcast that I've interviewed that were related to this film or this show. So Mark Simonetti is another one. He actually created all the cover art for George R.R. Martin's book, so A Song of Fire and Ice. He did all the concept work and illustration work, worked very closely with George R.R. Martin on all of his books. And I had him on the podcast, I think it was episode 45. And obviously I've also done a roundtable with Image Engine where we talked about a lot of their creature work they've done for Game of Thrones. And Matt Conway, Derek Spears, Sean Ritchie I was talking about with Walking Dead. There's a lot of other people I've had on the podcast that are all at some point worked on Game of Thrones, which is kind of interesting how long this has been going and how much talent has worked on this. So yeah, if I was to take a guess, I would imagine Pixelmondo doing a lot of the water work here. But again, just sheer amounts of destruction. In terms of tools used on this, because we'll get into that in a second, but obviously a lot of digital environments, a lot of destruction, a lot of pyro. You have mixture of practical fire and simulated fire there. In terms of what's used for a lot of this is actually 3ds Max. Sorry, my voice is breaking. 3ds Max with thinking particles, fume effects for a majority of this. So depending on what sequences, scanline VFX outside of animation, at least currently, is still heavy 3ds Max, fume effects, thinking particles for all the destruction. Pixelmondo, it kind of varies these days, Maya and Max for the most part. Houdini, Weta these days is a lot of Houdini as well as proprietary software, but again, I feel like on this they were doing more crowd work. But yeah, these are all big simulated explosions. I'm just guessing this is all scanline, but yeah, it's beautiful. I love all this. Obviously, shots like this, you're going to take into context that you've got digital doubles down here. Shots like this are, I'd assume, almost all digital. Otherwise, you would pretty much be adding a lot of digital elements into these. But yeah, I think it's just amazing having these crowds, having them on fire. Just the sheer amount of scale that goes into doing something like this is pretty epic. It's really cool. So again, assuming a scanline, then fume effects and thinking particles. There's a lot of flow line actually for a lot of the dust sims as well as I believe fire. So flow line might have been used for some of this stuff too. So shots like this I think are kind of interesting because I feel like this is more, if I were to guess, I would imagine a lot of comp fire with some simulated fire in here. And that's why I thought it was kind of interesting about some of the stuff that's more set dressed around some of the destruction. I feel like a lot of that has been simulated. But, you know, I think it's just a nice touch kind of having the origin point of where all the destruction happened and then all the foreground aftermath as well. So I think this shot here, I think it is, I would have just assumed that this is all practical, and so far it looks like it is. But there were some shots around here that, is this very steppy? And it makes me wonder, you know, whether some of this is simulated and it's got sampling issues. But yeah, I would just assume that this is all practical. But I might be wrong about that. And it could be steppy that they've just tried to like beef up the flames a little bit and it's caused that. I think it's kind of hilarious that I've been reading up the morning before I saw this that this guy was meant to be such a big badass, and then seeing that he pretty much lasted a couple of minutes was kind of interesting. So again, I talk about negative space quite a lot, but just even open areas like this, just having all the ash, having the embers, having everything encapsulated in dust on the ground, smoke up in the air, all of this together, it just really makes the shot. I feel like, again, like I'm always going to talk about negative space, but it's just so critical in shots like that. It's a lot harder to get that when you're looking at shots like this that have a lot of depth. Usually, if you're doing it all, you're adding it all digitally. It's a lot harder without heavy amounts of match move to put people into the environments correctly. So shots like this are not going to look as dense as a shot like that might. So yeah, it's all practical. Although I feel like those embers being added in digital, I could be wrong. But yeah, there's a lot of blood. Yeah, I mean, these shots, there's just so many. So I'm just going to kind of focus on some of the hero ones here, but it's kind of interesting just to kind of see the amount of work going into some of these things, and just because they're such quick cuts, you just don't appreciate everything that's going on a lot of the time. I still think that there is still a lot of like stock assets and second unit elements that were shot that are comped in. So I did spot like a lot of comp work like this that I'm pretty sure is not simulated at all. That's just added in to, again, just fill out the shots and add a lot more chaos to them. So I think while talking about Infinity War, I had one or two people mention like, you're repeating yourself a lot, and not that I'm repeating myself, it's more the fact that, you know, every shot they're going to be using the same tricks a lot of the time. So I just figured I'd talk about this again because one thing I loop back to is the negative space. In other words, adding volume, because this is something that really makes a shot. A lot of times just cleanliness, really, like if I were to cover up the top half of this, having it so clean down here just doesn't feel as real. Having the embers like this floating through, that CG, the fire, having the smaller embers back here, having the smoke, all this stuff, this is what really helps make a shot. Having the perspective, again, just foreground always works with good framing, but you know, that's not going to help with realism, but again, this is good framing. But in general, this is the sort of thing that just really makes a shot more believable, makes it more rich, have a lot more depth to it. So again, just shots like this are beautiful. You know, a lot of crowds, a lot of chaos. I would imagine a lot of this is matte painted, just to add a lot of detail, scale, you know, smoke, fire, all these different things. 3D creature, 3D characters, 3D fire. Really well executed. And I feel like you can see a lot of the dirt gets kind of ripped up as well, which is, again, it's just all these different layers of scale just really kind of make the shot. And again, something like this, just having characters running away, digital fire sim, I'm assuming fume, really cool. And so shots like this, you know, I would imagine are all practical. You might augment, like add in additional fire elements, but I mean, this is the problem with, you know, having HD, having 4K screens and being able to go frame by frame these days. You can always see all the gelatin on these guys just to protect them from burning alive. But you know, I always find like the real fire, especially underexposed, just really works well because you get to really see the richness, the contrast, the detail that goes into it. A lot of this stuff just comes secondary to it. It's just all the embers and everything in the air. Yeah, so I mean, I just love this sort of stuff. It's really well put together. And I feel like this is just one of those things that you're going to get guys with, I think he's got a protective mask on, I'm assuming. I hope he does. But yeah, I'd imagine there's just like a lot of this where it's just like a day of shooting people on fire and just kind of seeing what you can take from that and then put in the shot just to add that element of chaos. And again, just shot progression, seeing Dragon is over here now, Destruction is over here, and then bit by bit it evolves into the entire city being destroyed. But I think one of the things that really makes this episode so effective, and sorry, there's a bit of stuttering playing this back, but I think it's just purely the fact that there is just so many shots like this of destruction. Usually, just like with everything else, there's the wide shots, the fly over the dragon's shoulder shots with the digital environments. There's different ones of those to kind of give context to what's going on. And like I said, there's these really smart transitions where it ties destruction into the new area they're segueing to, or they use transitions where an environment blacks out from dust and destruction falling on the camera to reemerge in a different place. Like there's a lot of that going on, but usually there's only 5 or so shots of each type of thing, because that's all you need to get the point across. You have crowds when you need to tell a majority, like what's happening in the area of a city. You're going to have a few cutaways that are close up, but then the large scale shots that's going to show that context. So in general, all of this, like there's like 5 shots or whatever of each to kind of give that sense of what's going on at every single point. With the destruction here, all you need is 5, 6, 7, 8 shots to tell the story, just like with everything else. That, okay, she's going around blowing everything up. That's all you really need, but that's where they've gone overboard and just done destruction. And I think that's why everyone has loved this episode so much, is because the sheer volume of things being destroyed at every given turn is just crazy. So the overkill really makes the shot. Rather than it being that couple of shots, instead it is just the heavy amount of destruction, pyro, everything that probably isn't necessary, but by having just 10, 15 times more than you need, it just makes it even cooler, even more effective. It really just brings it into telling the story of this place as being leveled bit by bit. So again, stuff like this just looks beautiful. Me personally, when I look at shots like this, I'm always really critical about trying to get away from everything like fingers. In other words, like consistent debris just spilling everywhere. I think that this shot looks beautiful, so I'm not picking on it, but I am really critical of seeing like lots of really consistent debris just spilling out forever, because you got like lots of this stuff just everywhere. Because usually what I would imagine is you've got a lot in the beginning, piece here, flies out, it's going to have a lot of this stuff trailing off. As it continues, a lot of that is going to fall behind, and then you might just get a little bit moving along. But when you have like consistent amounts of, I call them sausage fingers, shooting out, it always just kind of looks really distracting to me. But I'm not saying that that's the case here. I think that this looks really, really great. If I was seeing it for a longer extended period of time, I might be more critical about it, but I think that this shot looks really cool. I like it. Again, I feel like this stuff here is all simulated. Again, all simulated with that unnecessary glow. It's not too bad, but again, I'm just really critical when I see too much glow, especially on daytime shots, even if they are overcast. So, I love this. There's just a lot of really beautiful destruction shots in here. So again, more of this, just lots and lots of destruction shots, having this all get destroyed. Back in the day, you would do this all practically because you're just not going to get that richness of like the destruction, the detail, everything. These days, you can do so much. I think this is beautiful, really well done. It's kind of interesting. You'll get, because it's still the same back in the day, even now, where when you need to get foreground fire, this is where you'll start to use practical elements. So as the flames hit the screen, you'll switch over to practical, and this is all CG. This is all real life elements they would have shot, having it all kind of hit plexiglass or something similar. So that way you're just getting nice fire that you can use up close. That's completely separate to everything else, but like, just you can't. It's not easy to get that level of detail full screen. I mean, you totally can. It's a lot more work. Whereas like cutting to this sort of stuff, like to this day, I still do a lot of that. It just makes sense opposed to trying to simulate it. So again, there's just so much of this, and it's really great. What a simulated fire, destruction. So like some of this stuff's comps, just the way the mattes are a bit blurry. It's kind of weird. But again, I feel like there's just a lot of this sort of stuff that just, I think it was just a day or two of just let's light people on fire and shoot it all. I do feel like some of this stuff is comped and it's kind of weird. Maybe it's just, I think the CG fire elements comped in here, but then you get the shots like this. This is all practical. It looks beautiful. It's just night and day different. Just like I said, having a bit more of an underexposed camera, you just get some really beautiful flames. Especially shooting all this raw, you can really push it a lot more. It's great. And again, a lot more destruction. So as far as I'm aware, this is all scanline, which, like I said, means thinking particles. I'm assuming fume or phoenix. Obviously, scanline is flowline, which they use as well. But in general, I'm assuming that they did all this stuff. It looks really beautiful. Some of this is footage, I'm assuming. Could be wrong. It's just the way it looks. I don't feel that simulated. But again, it's kind of hard to tell these days. But just sheer volume. I think that's the tricky thing. Like, go back 10 years, like a bunch of these shots would be very expensive. And these days, like, you build a setup and then you can just have a field day getting just really beautiful results. Yeah, I can guarantee that this is thinking particles. Just TP sims, like, it does rigid bodies very differently to Houdini and Maya. You can spot it a mile away, and so I'm very confident this is all 3ds Max. Looks cool. Like, I really like all the work that's done here. Maya, kidding. Okay, so yeah, and then just seeing shots like this, really important, just to kind of really emphasize like this place is being completely leveled. So it looks like all the smoke here is all simulated assets that are then dropped into the shots. So these are all like individual sims, are all layered up. But yeah, they look great. Feel like that's footage. Yeah, it's different footage comped onto each other. Pretty sure. Yeah, there's lots and lots of elements of fire footage all comped together, but it works. And that's the thing, I feel like a lot of these shots are going to be a combination of all these things together. So again, this is all CG. And a heck of a lot more destruction. So I think this is the shot that one of these shots here. I think this is this one here. I remember seeing this, just not being the biggest fan. So I think these are all comped fire elements, and I don't know. Like, personally, I wasn't a big fan of these. I do think that, like I said, this shot here and this shot here, different supervisor, if not different studio. And I feel like that shot here is the same kind of deal as the other high contrast shot. So I'm guessing that, and again, not knowing who did these, it's a bit harder to guess like how this is split up. But I'm imagining, let's say that Rodeo or someone did a shot like this, that maybe they get the Dragon asset or they get the Dragon render pass to get a comp all everything else together, but a lot of the pyro is all just footage, and I feel like personally, I don't feel like it really holds up in this shot. I remember seeing the shot when I was watching the show, and I was kind of like, ew, that got approved. Sorry to whoever did it. I'm just not personally a fan of that shot. And this is one I saw get referenced a lot. It's just, again, it's really critical to show, rather than from afar, you're actually getting to see a lot of the destruction happening up close in context of all the people showing that there's not, any care or finesse when it comes to all the destruction. It's endangering everyone. So I think there's like a lot of subtle story elements, that like visual story aids that are happening that just work really well. I find it interesting, this is more just on a side note, but I do find it interesting that you don't really see Danny too much in here. I was having this discussion the other day that typically when you have someone riding a CG beast, you're going to cut to them to tie it back to, they're interacting with it, they're a part of it. But for whatever reason, I can tell they purposely were having the dragon flying around doing all this destruction. It's not so much focused on her. There are shots that cut to her, but it's not so much focused on her and her performance as it is more on the aftermath and the destruction. Same way that when you're working on, let's say, a World War II movie, a lot of movies are going to not show so much reaction or personality to the other side, so let's say the Nazis or whoever it might be, because you want to kind of depersonify them, so that way you can show the I'm going to say with air quotes, the good guys, killing them off and doing that sort of stuff. It's kind of rare that you actually show the other party because you don't want to sympathize with them. You want to kind of tell this one-sided story. So what I find interesting with this particular episode is it's less focused on her and so much more focused on the reaction. Like, all the people on the ground have got way more screen time because you want to relate more to them than to her in this episode. So I think it's kind of interesting, like the different choices with what's focused on or who is focused more on screen. So not having as much screen time of her, but having more screen time of everyone else reacting kind of makes you side with them more than her. So again, this is a matte painting shot with a lot of effects elements, things like that. Is what it is. But it kind of, again, this is like pretty much the as above as you're going to get, like bird's eye view of everything going on, but it tells that story. And then again, lots and lots of destruction, really beautiful stuff. And these days, like doing destruction, like we do this in my mentorship, we do it in the live action series quite a lot. Like with the live action series, like we're specifically just doing lots of destruction for the first half of the course. And it's that way when you're assigned or appointed shots like this, it's a no-brainer to do. It's very simple to be able to pull off. But yeah, these look great. I love the work that they've done. Really cool. Shots like this are tricky because technically you'd want to have all the individual bricks break. And I could tell before I even saw it collapse, I was kind of like, yeah, if they show this far, then they're risking a lot because you're going to see that, you're breaking into a lot of pieces, but not as many pieces as you would probably expect to see. And this is one of those segues I was talking about. So initially having dragon up in the air, cause destruction, having the destruction spill out into the ocean here to segue to Jaime Lannister. So there's a lot of this going on throughout the entire thing to kind of tie it all together and allow you to segue easier between all the different points of view, all the different stories, without getting too lost. I think they do a good job of it. It's a little bit overkill. But yeah, I mean, if you look at the original shots and seeing all the aftermath now, kind of nuts. So again, more destruction. And we already looked at that shot earlier. And then more aftermath here. So just in general, I mean, there's just so much of this. Like, I don't want to go on and on. These are all CG dust plumes. I believe this is all Flowline from Scanline. That simulated it all. I could be wrong. But I know that this is a sequence that they worked on. So that's all 3ds Max, Flowline, Fume Effects, TP. So just skipping ahead a little bit here. Again, just more and more destruction. So that's what I mean. Like, eventually you get kind of desensitized to this just because there is just so much of it going on. Yeah, it's kind of subtle, but this is the sort of thing that I'm picky about. Like when you see rocks falling that is continuously emitting dust. But yeah, it still looks really beautiful. It's just, yeah, they're continuing to emit dust. Like, where's it all coming from? It always frustrates me, because usually it's a progression. You imagine that like a rock is covered in dust, it's falling with dust. Eventually the rock escapes the dust. All the dust that's on it eventually starts to, fall off of it. So unless it's continuing to break down, like let's say with snowballs, things like that, typically you have rocks that emit a lot of dust at the beginning, and progressively over time they emit less. And it's just like one of those things that always bugs me when 3 shots in and the stuff's been falling forever and it's still continuing to emit dust. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot of little hacks that I do that kind of, it's more creatively how I like to do things, but everyone's got their different approach. Yeah, it's just a lot of simulated fire. It's a bit low res in bits, but again, like when you have a lot of it, it's challenging. But again, yeah, just here, having all the crap in the air is just so important to really populate a shot and just make it feel like there's a lot going on. I imagine it's quite clean, the original shoot, but you populate all this in post, and it just really gives a lot to the shot. I guess doing green and orange CG flames is always going to be tricky side by side. I feel like some of these elements are really low res. Some of this other stuff is just beautiful. I mean, yeah, it looks like it's all simulated. If it is, then I love the shader work. That's really cool. Again, just so much going on. So I think this is one of the last shots here. Just having that progressive cracking, all that. I mean, it's stuff that we've all seen before, but looks nice. I like how that came together. Not a big fan of her makeup. Yeah, so as the camera transitions into the fireball, that's all stock. As I was saying before, it's just easier when you're doing full screen fire, just to comp all those elements in. And then this is one of those transitions where dust falls over the camera and then it clears into, I think, Jamie and Cersei underground. But there's, again, just like a lot of those transitions. I mean, overall, I just wanted to do this to more kind of chat about it, give a bit of context. You'd see like a lot of CG dust and rocks and everything falling down. Like just the amount of detail at work that went into this is more about volume. So I feel like, although like not every single shot holds up entirely, I think it's more about quantity than anything. And still, like, everything's beautiful. The amount of work that's gone into this, like, it's at the level of a feature film in one single episode of a TV show, and having such a vast amount of talent put on the show to make it actually happen. Like, I think it's really amazing, really impressive, really inspiring to see something of this quantity. And I feel like it's kind of interesting with what's going on with Game of Thrones right now. Like, a lot of people are speaking very negatively about it, but interestingly, there weren't that many people talking negatively about the show as a whole. It's because I think that everyone's kind of, it's sleight of hand, everyone's being distracted by the amount of visual effects work in this particular episode. It's just all the destruction everyone's falling in love with, and they're less complainy about some of the story elements or the writing. So again, this shot really bothers me, how there's like this 2 layers of defocus, like her and then this and then this. So whoever did this shot, bad person, bad comp, just that shouldn't be out of focus. But you know, all these other shots look fine. Where were we? Yeah, these are all fine. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I just wanted to kind of nerd out about this and give my 2 cents about it, you know, rather than getting too technical about it. But I might, once Game of Thrones is done, I might try and put together a roundtable with some of the studios just to kind of talk about some of this stuff. I think it'd be a lot of fun. So who knows? But I'd love to see and hear your thoughts on this as well. What's your take? And if there are other episodes that you might be interested in seeing covered as well. I kind of just decided last night that I might do a VFX breakdown specifically on this. So, like I said, I haven't had a chance to talk to Weta because it's, I guess it's morning there now, but no one's at work yet. But yeah, I did speak to a few people at some of the other studios this morning just to kind of get a bit of clarification about like what I assume. And, you know, I think it's pretty spot on, like who's doing what. Rodeo, Scanline, Pixo. Pixo, like I said, I completely forgot till the last minute, but I'm assuming that they did all the boats. That's just my guess. Alright, so yeah, hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you think. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got a lot from it. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know what questions you have or even observations that you got from watching this video. And obviously I'm going to be posting a lot more similar content to this, as well as tutorials as well on other similar visual effects topics. So if you want, subscribe to my channel, and it would mean the world to me if you could take a second to share this with others. That being said, I'll be back with some new videos shortly. Thanks again for subscribing and for sharing. And like I said, leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you. And even if it is just to let me know that you want to see more of this series of VFX breakdowns, even a simple yes is enough just to let me know that you want to see more. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon. Get the free visual effects class. This is a free 18-hour class on live action visual effects, covering destruction, fire and explosions, lighting, rendering, all within a real visual effects pipeline. Sign up now, it's free at vfxcourse.com.